We thought that it's important to introduce agonism into museum space because museums are traditionally places of official memory. Those are places that, especially in Germany, are dominated by cosmopolitan memory. They're dominated by memory that argues that war is evil, that we have to focus on the suffering of the victims, and that we can solve the problems of warfare and victimhood by developing a human rights agenda. And we want to challenge that kind of facile consensus. And we thought the official space of a museum is a perfect space to do that and to launch a provocative, agonistic exhibit that tries to charge the question again, the question about warfare and its reasons, with political relevance. Working as an academic in a museum environment is a challenge because it requires all kinds of translations that are often required in interdisciplinary work, but it's more of a challenge in a museum. One of the first challenges is to translate terms, to agree on terms. We have some important key terms that we were clearly prepared to define, but there are also minor terms that we had to agree upon and work with, and that takes time. It's also a great opportunity for self-reflexivity. What I love, and what was for me the most valuable experience also is, and a challenge, to understand to speak through objects and not through language. As an academic, our tool is language. We can use tools, we can make them up, we can put them together, and we don't need permission for it. As a museum expert, as a curator, you are dependent on objects. You have to find them. You have to convince people to lend them to you, and you have to then, only then can you start to create a narrative. You have to imagine that as an academic, if you're an academic and you craft a text, imagine if you have to ask permission to use certain words from other people, trying to convince them that you are entitled to these words. That's, I would say, is an analogy of the tough ways of learning to narrate through objects in three-dimensional space. It's a very, very different language than the language we as academics are used to. That's a challenge, and that's a steep learning curve, and I hope we have managed some of it. I've certainly learned a lot. In practice, we have worked together by meeting. By meeting at least, I would say, every 2 to 3 months over a period of a year and a half. And often enough, it was key discussions about our theories that are informing the project. And it was also at the very same time, so from two ends, I think, there was interesting communications. From the academic end, to try to convey and put into practical terms, more practical terms, our theoretical approaches, of which we ourselves didn't know how they would translate into culture. And I think on the other hand, learning from the museum and to speak visually, to try to understand how that really works, how you try to communicate to a public that is non-academic to a large extent, how one speaks through objects. I think these two learning processes, they took time to talk to each other. I think the biggest component was to meet and talk. And in that process, you had explicit transfer of knowledge, explicit learning, and you had a tacit learning of being also in the same space where museum curators work normally, begin to understand how their databases work, for example, and begin to understand how the system of putting objects together, loaning objects, how the practicality of that worked. So I think the key was to spend time together. The key was to listen to each other. I think that's probably the most important aspect, and that takes time. And there it takes misunderstandings. Misunderstandings happen. Sometimes they happen in places where one is prepared for it, and sometimes they happen in completely unpredictable places. And then has to go back, and has to also think backwards about the last meeting. What did I understand? What did I perhaps miss? Was I clear? Was I understood? And then come back. 2 months later, come back. Try to have a memory of what worked and what didn't work, and ask, where can we help? Where do I need help?